Techniques, Historical Development, from The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. Primitive technique. It is scarcely possible to give here a history of technique in its universal aspect, as we have just defined it. We are only now beginning to know a little of the history of mechanical technique. It is enough to recall the works of André Leroi-Gourhan, Richard Lefebvre de Noët, Marc Bloch, and others, but the full history of technique has yet to be written. My book is not a history. I shall speak in a historical vein only when it is necessary to the understanding of the technical problem in society today. Technical activity is the most primitive activity of man. There is the technique of hunting, of fishing, of food gathering, and later of weapons, clothing, and building. And here we face a mystery. What is the origin of this activity? It is a phenomenon which admits of no complete explanation. By patient research, one finds areas of imitation, transitions from one technical form to another, examples of penetration. But at the core there is a closed area, the phenomenon of invention. It can be shown that technique is absorbed into man's psychology and depends upon that psychology and upon what has been called technical motivation. But we have no explanation of how an activity which once did not exist came to be. How did man come to domesticate animals, to choose certain plants to cultivate? The motivating force, we are told, was religious, and the first plants were cultivated with some magical end in mind. This is likely, but how was the selection made? And how did it happen that the majority of these plants were edible? How did man come to refine metals and make bronze? Was it chance, as the legend of the discovery of Phoenician glass has it? This is obviously not the answer. One is left with an enigma, and there is some point in emphasizing that there is here the same mysterious quality as in the appearance of life itself. Each primitive operation of man implies the bridging of such an enormous gulf between instinct and the technical act that a mystic aura hovers about all subsequent development. Our modern worship of technique derives from man's ancestral worship of the mysterious and marvelous character of his own handiwork. It has not been sufficiently emphasized that technique has evolved along two distinct paths. There is the concrete technique of Homo faber, man the maker, to which we are accustomed, and which poses the problems we have normally studied. There is also the technique of a more or less spiritual order, which we call magic. It may seem questionable. Nevertheless, magic is a technique in the strictest sense of the word, as has been clearly demonstrated by Marcel Mauss. Magic developed along with other techniques as an expression of man's will to obtain certain results of a spiritual order. To attain them, man made use of an aggregate of rites, formulas, and procedures, which, once established, do not vary. Strict adherence to form is one of the characteristics of magic. Forms and rituals, masks which never vary, the same kind of prayer wheels, the same ingredients for mystical drugs, for formulae, for divination, and so on. All these became set and were passed on. The slightest variation in word or gesture would alter the magical equilibrium. There is a relationship between the ready-made formula and a precise result. The gods being propitiated obey such an invocation out of necessity. All the more reason that they be given no opportunity to escape compliance, because the invocation is not correctly formulated. This fixity is a manifestation of the technical character of magic. When the best possible means of obtaining the desired result has been found, why change it? Every magical means, in the eyes of the person who uses it, is the most efficient one. In the spiritual realm, magic displays all the characteristics of a technique. It is a mediator between man and the higher powers, just as other techniques mediate between man and matter. It leads to efficacy because it subordinates the power of the gods to men, and it secures a predetermined result. It affirms human power in that it seeks to subordinate the gods to men, just as technique serves to cause nature to obey. Magic clearly displays the characteristics of primitive technique, as Leroi-Gourhan indicates when he says that technique is a cloak for man, a kind of cosmic vestment. In his conflict with matter, in his struggle to survive, man interposes an intermediary agency between himself and his environment, and this agency has a twofold function. It is a means of protection and defense. Alone, man is too weak to defend himself. It is also a means of assimilation. Through technique, man is able to utilize to his profit powers that are alien or hostile. He is able to manipulate his surroundings so that they are no longer merely his surroundings, but become a factor of equilibrium and of profit to him. Thus, as a result of technique, man transforms his adversaries into allies. These characteristics of material technique correspond perfectly to the characteristics of magical technique. There also, man is in conflict with external forces, with the world of mystery, spiritual powers, and mystical currents. But there, too, man erects a barrier around himself, for he would not know how to defend himself by his own unaided intellect. He uses any means that will serve him both for defense and for adjustment. He turns to his own profit the hostile powers, which are obliged to obey him by virtue of his magical formulas. Masson-Oursel, in a recent study, confirms this. He shows that magic is basically a scholasticism of efficiency, which man employs as an instrument against his environment, that magic is pragmatic, yet has a precision that must be called objective, and that its efficiency is demonstrated only in certain consecrations or disqualifications. Masson-Oursel rightly believes that magic preceded technique. In fact, that magic is the first expression of technique. Plainly, we have had two streams of technique from the very beginning. How does it happen that we never take cognizance of the second? There are a number of reasons. We can leave aside the causes that come from modern psychology. Because we are obsessed with materialism and do not take magic seriously, it has little interest for us, and we are unaware even today, as we study technique, the techniques that relate to men, that we are drawing on the great stream of magical techniques. But this neglect is due as well to objective causes. In relation to purely material factors, it has been demonstrated that every milieu resists imitating the techniques of another social or ethnic group. Surely this resistance was much stronger in the realm of magical techniques. Here were all the taboos and prohibitions, the immense strength of magical conservatism. Then, too, whereas material techniques are relatively distinct and independent of one another, magical techniques are rapidly elaborated into a rigid system. Everything is of a piece. Everything is dependent upon everything else. Consequently, nothing can be meddled with, nothing modified without threat to the whole structure of beliefs and activities. Hence, their weak expansive power and their strong power of defense against alien magical techniques. The realm of magical practice is limited, and there is little or no diffusion. Propagation begins with spiritualist religions which are not bound to special magical rites. There is then no possibility of choice between different rival magical techniques. Yet expansion and choice are decisive factors in technical progress. There is no real progress in the realm of magic. Here lies its fundamental difference. There is no progress in space, no progress in time. Indeed, the tendency of magic is to regress. And because magical technique is tied to one ethnic group, to one given form of civilization, it disappears completely when that group or civilization disappears. When a civilization dies, it transmits to its heirs its material, but not its spiritual apparatus. Tools, houses, and methods of manufacture live on, and, more or less reincarnated, are to be met with again. There may be a temporary material regression in periods of great destruction, but the lost ground is recovered, as if a collective historical memory made possible the recovery of what had been lost several generations before. But magical techniques, rites, formulas, and sacrificial practices disappear irremediably. The new civilization will fashion its own new stock of magic, which has little in common with the old. Only a set of generalizations so broad as to mean nothing, and over-hasty analogies create the belief that magical forms are perpetuated and renewed. Indeed, they live on only in the minds of the initiates, and not in any human or social reality. Consequently, a magical technique that is not passed on in time or space does not follow the same evolutionary curve as material technique. There is not a progression of discoveries built one upon the other. Rather, discoveries remain side by side and do not affect one another. There is another factor in the regression of magical techniques, the problem of evidence. In material techniques, choice is relatively simple. Since every technique is subordinate to its immediate result, it is only a question of choosing the one that produces the most satisfactory result. And in the material domain, that result can readily be seen. That one form of axe is superior to another is a judgment not beyond a normal man. in spite of the extreme difficulty primitive man experienced when faced with such a choice. But with magical techniques, the same certainty or force of evidence does not exist. Who can judge their relative efficiency? Magical efficiency is not always to be measured by a clear material result, such as making rain fall, but may have to do with some purely spiritual phenomena, or even with material phenomena over a long period of time. Here matters are not clear, nor the choice easy. The difficulty becomes even more acute when we think about the uncertainty of the reasons for failure. Was the magical technique really inefficient, or was the one who used it incompetent? The common reaction is to blame the magician rather than the technique, and here again we see an element of immobility in magic. The two great streams of technique which we have traced from their beginnings evolved in completely different ways. In manual technique we observe an increase and later a multiplication of discoveries, each based on the other. In magic, we see only endless new beginnings, as the fortunes of history and its own inefficiency call its procedures into question. Explanation becomes even more difficult when we note that in the magical domain, too, our own era has achieved an overwhelming superiority. Our magical techniques have become really effective. These techniques obviously must not be confused with religious life or anything of that kind. This is purely a social phenomenon, both in aim and in form. However, the two aspects of technique, although both are social, are sharply separated and would seem to have interacted very little anywhere. Greece. Technique is essentially Oriental. It was principally in the Near East that technique first developed, and it had very little in the way of scientific foundation. It was entirely directed toward practical application and was not concerned with general theories, which alone can give rise to scientific movements. This predominance of technique in the East points up an error which is found throughout Western thought, that the Oriental mind is turned toward the mystical and has no interest in concrete action, whereas the Western mind is oriented toward know-how and action, and hence toward technique. In fact, the East was the cradle of all action, of all past and primitive technique in the present sense of the word, and later of spiritual and magical technique as well. The Greeks, however, were the first to have a coherent scientific activity and to liberate scientific thought. But then a phenomenon occurred which still astonishes historians, the almost total separation of science and technique. Doubtless, this separation was less absolute than the example of Archimedes has led historians to believe. But it is certain that material needs were treated with contempt, that technical research was considered unworthy of the intellect, and that the goal of science was not application but contemplation. Plato shunned any compromise with application, even in order to forward scientific research. For him, only the most abstract possible exercise of reason was important. Archimedes went even further. True, he rationalized practice and even made applications to a certain degree. But his machine was to be destroyed after it had demonstrated the exactness of his numerical reckonings. Why did the Greeks adopt this Malthusian attitude toward activity? There are two possible answers. Either they were not willing or they were not able, and it is likely that both are true. Abel Rey has devoted the 5th volume of his Sciences Techniques to the Greeks. According to him, Greece, in her decline, became incapable of sustaining the ideal of hard, disinterested labor, the ideal of an essentially contemplative intelligence disdainful of all utility. She then fell back on the techniques of the East. She was involved in them by her own techniques, for she had none the less sought to satisfy men's vital needs, in spite of the contempt in which she held them. Confronted with technical necessity, Greece lost her inventive genius and turned to Eastern technique. She did not know, says Abel Rey, how to find the bridge between know-how and know-why. This is true for the period of decadence, the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, but it does not seem to be the case in the preceding period. In the 5th century BC, Greece experienced rapid technical development, although later it came to an abrupt halt. In their golden age of science, the Greeks could have deduced the technical consequences of their scientific activity, but they did not wish to. Walter asks, did the Greeks, obsessed with harmony, check themselves at the very point at which inquiry ran the risk of going to excess and threaten to introduce a monstrosity into their civilization? This was the result of a variety of factors, most of which were of a philosophic nature. For one thing, theirs was a conception of life which scorned material needs and the improvement of practical life, discredited manual labor, because of the practice of slavery, held contemplation to be the goal of intellectual activity, refused the use of power, respected natural things. The Greeks were suspicious of technical activity because it represented an aspect of brute force and implied a want of moderation. Man, however humble his technical equipment, has from the very beginning played the role of sorcerer's apprentice in relation to the machine. This feeling on the part of the Greeks was not a reflection of a primitive man's fear in the face of something he does not understand, the explanation given today when certain persons take fright at our techniques. Rather, it was the result, perfectly mastered and perfectly measured, of a certain conception of life. It represented an apex of civilization and intelligence. Here we find the supreme Greek virtue, self-control. The rejection of technique was a deliberate, positive activity involving self-mastery, recognition of destiny, and the application of a given conception of life. Only the most modest techniques were permitted, those which would respond directly to material needs in such a way that these needs did not get the upper hand. In Greece, a conscious effort was made to economize on means and to reduce the sphere of influence of technique. No one sought to apply scientific thought technically because scientific thought corresponded to a conception of life, to wisdom. The great preoccupation of the Greeks was balance, harmony, and moderation. Hence, they fiercely resisted the unrestrained force inherent in technique, and rejected it because of its potentialities. For these same reasons, magic had relatively little importance in Greece. Rome. Social technique was still in its infancy. Doubtless, there had been some attempts at social organization. Those of certain pharaohs and those of the Persian Empire were not negligible. But such organizations could be maintained only by police power, whereas the exact opposite is true of genuine social organization. By the very fact of its existence, coercion demonstrates the absence of political, administrative, and juridical technique. For this reason, the great empires of the past are of little importance to our study. Correlatively, an army, even the army of the Chaldeans who advanced the art of war furthest, was a fairly inorganic crew whose aim was pillage and which applied no social technique. The army of Alexander made use of genuine strategy, but this was almost exclusively military and had no sociological foundations or attributes. It was the expression not of a people, but of a state, and therefore lacked the substance necessary to technique. In Rome, however, we pass on at one step to the perfection of social technique, both civil and military. Everything in Roman society was related to Roman law in its multiple forms, both public and private. To characterize the technique of this law, in the period during which it flourished, from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, we can say, first of all, that it was not the fruit of abstract thought, but rather of an exact view of the concrete situation, which the Romans attempted to turn to account with the fewest possible means. This realism respected justice and acknowledged history and necessity. From this concrete, experimental view, which the Romans held consciously, their administrative and judicial technique developed, and a kind of discipline appeared, the use of a minimum of means. This discipline, which probably had its foundations in religion, is one of the secrets of the whole development. To the degree that the Roman had to respond to necessity, and at the same time not permit himself excessive luxury, it was necessary to refine every means, to bring it to perfection, to exploit it in every possible way, and to give it free rein, without shackling it with exceptions and secondary rules. No social situation developed which did not immediately find its response in organization. Nor could this response be the creation of a new means, but rather the perfection of an old means. Indeed, the proliferation of means is thought even today to denote technological weakness. A second element in the Roman development of organization was the search for an equilibrium between the purely technical factor and the human factor. Judicial technique did not begin as a substitute for man. In Roman judicial technique, there was no question of eliminating initiative and responsibility, but rather of allowing them to operate and to assert themselves. It was not until the 3rd century AD that judicial technique attempted to deal with the details of life, to regulate everything, to foresee everything, thereby leaving the individual in a state of complete inertia. But the great judicial era of Rome was one of equilibrium. The law laid down the framework and supplied the means that men could use in following their own initiative. Of course, this presupposed a civic sense corresponding to the technical conception. The equilibrium between the two was evident in the system of procedure we call bureaucracy. In it is found, with an almost disconcerting simplicity, the perfect type of procedure. And there we find that one of the conditions of technique is respect for the individual, who is not yet considered apart from society. A third characteristic of Roman technique was that it was directed toward a precise end, the internal coherence of society. This technique was not self-justifying. It did not have as its raison d'être its own self-development, and it was not imposed from the outside. It was not a kind of scaffolding which held independent elements together. It sought rather to promote cohesion. The foundation of society was not the police. It was an organization which enabled society to make the least possible use of the police. A wide variety of techniques, religious, administrative, and financial, were obviously needed to execute this design, but in no case was there recourse to force. When it appeared that the state would be compelled to use force, the organizational sense of the Romans led them to abandon a given project rather than attempt to maintain it by force. Force is never economical, and Rome was economical in all things. This social coherence was the first judicial technique the world had known. It was also the basis for the Roman military system, which was a direct expression of civil society in that it had the same respect for efficiency and economy. From it came the development of organs of transport, food supply, and so on, and the Roman conception of mass strategy and their refusal to create heroes. Combat was thus reduced to its most utilitarian level. A fourth element was continuity. The judicial technique of the Romans was constantly being readapted in accordance with a historical plan. It involved a policy of watchful waiting while circumstances were not propitious, at the same time making preparations for the right moment, and when that moment came, carrying out the plan decisively. As regards material techniques, the Romans did not develop them as brilliantly. From the 4th to the 1st century BC, and after the 2nd century AD, there was almost total stagnation. Tools and armaments no longer evolved. But from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, a technical revival took place. Practical necessity, on the economic and military levels and with regard to transport, was met by the production of animal-powered machines, forges, water wheels, pumps, plows, the screw press, cord-operated ballistic engines, etc. The Romans possessed a remarkable understanding of applicability. Their judicial system could be applied always and everywhere in the empire. It was adapted to an unfailing continuity. And these were totally new phenomena which Rome introduced. Later, Rome was allowed to drift into a technical vertigo. The end was near.